As Jonathan has asked initially, what are the issues that the South Asian community in Canada are grappling with today? What do you think are like primary problems?
Okay, so it depends on where you are as well, but and whether you're first, second, third, or 1.5 generation and so on. But I know with many, like I myself am second generation. My parents were born in India and immigrated here in the 70s. With me, it's a retention of language and culture with my own children, with the third generation. So even though I myself I'm a Punjabi instructor at KPU. In addition to the other courses I teach Punjabi language, and I'm very passionate about preserving the Punjabi language. I'm a member of the Punjabi Language Education Association and so on. But having my own children speak it, when they were younger, they spoke it. And as they grew older, they understand it, but they're hesitant to speak it. So one of the, so the retention and of the language and culture, as I said. And another thing I've noticed is sometimes criticism amongst second generations, such as myself, of coconuts. I don't know if people still use that term, right? Brown on the white outside.
They do.
You know it. Okay, you're smiling and nodding. Okay, so like I know my own children are dealing with that. They're in high school right now. They're 14 and 15, and if they do try to speak the language, sometimes they're made fun of because of their pronunciation or syntax, etc. errors. So that's definitely one thing. So I gave Punjabi as an example, but I'm sure it's equally difficult to maintain Gujarati or Hindi and Bengali and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one I think is this idea of belonging and identity. And I know it's one that I've definitely struggled with growing up. Sometimes I felt like I didn't really belong here. Especially because my interests were so different from my peer group. Like I was very much interested in Punjabi literature and Punjabi culture to a higher degree rather than just the Bhangra dance and so on. I was really passionate about all that, and I never found somebody. I was just a little weird, I guess, in terms of what I like to focus on. And I remember I lived in Punjab, India for 1 year during my master's doing research. It was a Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute grant. And then I realized that I didn't really belong there either. So, like where do I really belong? What is my space? And I know that others definitely, like when I talk informally with my children, I know my younger one has expressed to me that, I wish I hadn't stopped doing Bhangra, which is a Punjabi folk dance. We had him in a Bhangra team before, or that I wish I hadn't, or I wish, sometimes he says, I wish I knew more about my culture. And I know he's trying to watch a lot of South Asian films and so on. We've always tried to watch them with him, subtitles. So they're both dealing with issues like that right now. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think this idea of belonging, like it's something everybody I know struggles with, but I think definitely people of color, minorities in Canada. So in Surrey, which is where I'm situated, or Vancouver, et cetera, it's more cosmopolitan. We have mix of cultures, but there's still some areas in throughout Canada where it's predominantly, WASP, right? And for many people, the idea of Canada, when they think about it, it's not multicultural Canada, it's still that white Canada. Right?
Yes.
Maybe. I think I hit on most of them. I hope that I'll probably think of a few later, but oh well. Yeah.
We can come back to those.
Yeah.
Sorry, what is the legacy of discriminatory or exclusive policy South Asian communities are facing today?
I think the legacy is like we don't have overt discrimination, right? Like we did with the Kamagata Maru, with the continuous journey policy or the Chinese head tax and so on.
Mhm.
But we definitely have it in other ways. Like people will sometimes homogenize the community, like, oh yeah, aren't South Asians really, and I know that's something I struggled with during my dissertation, because I'm talking about shame and honor and how women have to face it more than men. Like they wear the burden, or they carry the burden a bit more in South Asian communities. But having said that, I made a point to, in the introduction of my dissertation, to also point out that we have to remember these are heterogeneous communities as well. We don't want to homogenize the whole group, and many times we have that critical that criticism. There's one other thing that I just remembered. I want to go back to the other challenge facing. One thing is that I do see that I want to be careful to use the right wording, but especially in areas like Surrey and Abbotsford, where there's a high South Asian population, and especially a Punjabi population with all the immigration, especially with the in the past few years coming in. Another thing that I see the community struggling with is integration. And I know when I was growing up, I had friends of many different backgrounds and cultures, which was great. You learn about others' cultures and so on. And one thing that I do want to be, I want to encourage new immigrants to do is, although I realize that it is, in many ways, it's helpful and easier to associate with people who speak the same language, etc. Just in terms of communication, I do want to encourage them to interact and on a regular basis with other people of other communities. I know my own father, for example, he was illiterate. He didn't know how to read and write in Punjabi, much less in English. But because he came here during the 70s and he interacted with others at work and in our neighborhood, he was able to carry on conversations in English. But now I see that people who have studied English, even, gone to school and studied basic English in India, when they come here, they can't necessarily carry on a conversation because they've never needed to. You can go to the bank and speak in Punjabi. You can go to Fruitacana and in the stores and speak in Punjabi. So they don't have that exposure. So an encouragement to go beyond, not just beyond the borders of Surrey, etc., but beyond, your local neighborhood and meet others. Yeah.
Thank you. Does the exclusion of South Asian history in Canada have impacted on the identity construction of South Asians in Canada today?
The exclusion of, say it again?
Okay. Does the exclusion of South Asian history in Canada have impacted on the identity construction of South Asians in Canada today?
Oh, yes, I definitely believe in that. Like, I know when I was growing up, I read I think it was in grade 11, was the first time I read something about Komagata Maru, right? And it was one sentence, and then I researched it and looked it up myself. I think during my undergrad days at UBC, and I always wondered, well, why don't we hear about that? Because I know we were here, right? We in the textbooks, any types of resources, it's always the white Canadian you hear about, but not about the Chinese or the Indo-Canadian and so on. And I think that has a lot to do with these feelings of identity and belonging if we're not even mentioned in the textbooks? If we're not mentioned in the curriculum, then how can we ever feel like other people? Maybe some individuals might not even feel Canadian. I feel Canadian, but I don't know if other people will ever look at me and say, "Oh yeah, she's Canadian," or if they'll always say first, "Oh yeah, she's. Oh, I wonder where she's from." I remember in one of my Punjabi classes a number of maybe about 10 years ago, even. I had a young woman. She was fourth generation Canadian. Her maybe even fifth. Her great grandfather came from India, and she said people are, and she just mentioned she worked in a bank, and people always automatically assumed she would know Punjabi because of her last name, even though she couldn't speak it. And then I remember I had other. Like I could have another student, and she might be from England, or she might, without an accent, somebody might have moved here when she was 7, right, from a Slovakian country or from England or Denmark, where have you, and lost their accent over the years, but they'll never be seen as an immigrant, whereas somebody whose family has been here for 5 generations, just because of what you see,
she looks like,
automatically they're the immigrant, that they're excluded.
Yes, thank you. And let's continue with our second last question. How would you describe identity construction of South Asian community through BC?
South Asian identity construction through like the BC education system or BC politics, or
Through
BC education system.
Oh, education system.
Yeah.
That's okay. Okay, ask me the question one more time.
Yes. How would you describe identity construction of South Asian community through BC education system?
I think teachers, especially in areas like Newton in Surrey, where they see a strong South Asian presence in their classrooms, they are more cognizant of the fact that they have to be more inclusive and talk about the community. But it is difficult for many to do that because of the resources, a lack of resources available. I know that recently there was a project done, University of Fraser Valley, South Windsor-Baines, and I know Balbir Gurm of our university was involved with it. They made a South Asian Legacies project, and part of that was to create resources so that others could make, other teachers, other educators could make use of that. So, and the interesting thing there is, of course, it was South Asians who had to initiate that project, right? Because others don't realize that who and what is being excluded. But definitely, it's been mostly exclusionary. If there's just one or two South Asians, or a handful of South Asians in the school, in the classroom, and so on, then people don't feel the same. They might not have the same. They'll teach to the majority, right? And even in some classrooms where it is a majority of, where South Asians might be the majority, it's just easier to do what's always been done before, because the resources are there, the lesson plans are there, and so on. For example, I know one of my sons was complaining about not being. Sorry, I want to use specific examples, but ancient civilizations. You have so many resources for ancient Rome, for ancient Greece, for Mesopotamia, and so on, right? Egypt and so on. But the Indus Valley civilization was there, and an important civilization for many years. And some have never even heard of it, and others might have heard of it, but because when they look through the resources available in the lists, in the BC education curriculum lists, whatever, there's nothing there. So they'll go to what's easier. So you're perpetuating, you're continuing the exclusion. If you're saying, yeah, they should, and they can, there's nothing that says that they can't include Indus Valley, but because you don't have another person, you don't have somebody with a responsibility of finding or creating these resources, then you're not really solving the problem.
May I ask a couple of follow-up questions?
Sure.
Yes. Go ahead.
First, you mentioned that, although there are attempts to actually teach some of this, be more inclusive, it's the resources are not there.
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm asking like very, very, it should be clear to me, but I want to know like what kind of resources or who allocate those resources.
Oh, okay. So I guess this is because I do have my experience as a public school teacher for 4 years. Right. Yeah. So resources are the Ministry of Education.
Okay.
Has on their website, etc. They make lists. They have prescribed learning outcomes. I think they're called something else, but students will learn about an ancient civilization or something. And then they'll give some examples, and Indus Valley Civilization might be one of the examples. And then there's other lists of BC government approved resources, so that if your school orders these, the school will, I think it's okay for the school to order these ones or something like that in their budget. They're approved. And you have lists and lists for ancient Rome and lists for, ancient Egypt and so on. But the list for Indus Valley civilization might be this small. And sometimes they give sample projects, and not just the ministry, but, teachers will Google, lesson plans or ideas for unit plans for ancient civilizations. And you'll find tons and tons on other on Greece and Rome and so on, but for Indus Valley, it'll be very, very limited. Having said that, with the internet and other things, it's making things way easier. But if I'm a teacher in a public school system, and I think, okay, I'm going to teach them about this, and I'm going to have them do an independent project, like this group can research the agriculture of ancient Rome. This group can research the government of ancient Rome. And then you want to look for age-appropriate resources, your library won't have any. So there's things like that in the system, that just the way it's set up. There'll be 100 books on the other things, and then you might have 2 or 3 books on Indus Valley civilization.
So this is more of a question of priority then. How South Asian communities, although there is an attempt to represent or include, but when we dig deeper, there's still little priority.
The follow through is not there.
Right. Okay, sounds good. I think there is also this question of, so our project, a little bit about it is focus on the missing stories, which is most of what you've been telling us today, which is very helpful and very reassuring. What we're trying to do is also trying to use some examples of exclusionary policy, or basically draw like a single line from, exclusionary policy in the past to current legacy today, in how people are being seen or represented, or whether or not stories are included. And things that we're focusing on is what is seen as normal, and what is seen as part of Canadian fabric of the society. And are there other things that you would like to suggest us to explore? I know that we're going to explore some of the things around like whiteness and why it's seen as normal, whereas, South Asian communities have had their hands in actually building this nation, but I'm including myself there, but we're not seen as quite important, or it's not very easy for people to associate the communities to be part of nation building, unless there's like a huge or like very, very, what is it called? Like very flashy example like Jagmeet Singh or Harjit Sajjan, something along that line. Those would be like something that is, you know, themed, but it's also tokenized in the same sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, are there any other things that you would like to suggest us to explore a little bit more to help us focus on this? So the project is on identity construction, but we're trying to focus on missing stories to help, you know, basically.
One thing that I also try to bring up, I know with this South Asian legacy, is that what it was called? With this one project that Satinder Bains, the University of Fraser Valley, and Ranbir were
South Asian history?
Sorry?
Is it the South Asian South Asian?
Yes. The house. Yeah, I keep saying legacy. Sorry, but one of the things is the idea of the common man, like you common person. I believe I said man, but anyways, if you have a South Asian contribution, you know, it's tokenized and so on, and with the white person, you know, you have the common, what was going on with the everyday person, what was, you know, how was their life and so on, and you don't have that, you still don't have that representation of that, like what was the common person doing, the common person's experience. You have a generalized, when you look at any you know, names, etc., it's like, you know, big political leaders and so on, but there's other people like women, definitely, they're missing stories. You know, what were they doing? How were they, you know, for the first, you know, number of years, they were excluded from being here. Like they were allowed, then they were excluded, then finally they were allowed again. So that can be one of the reasons people always use that as an excuse. Well, there weren't women here, but eventually they did come. And what about them? What were they doing? What were their experiences? What were the experiences of young children in the school system? You know, how did you know, you have those stories about, the Great Depression, you know, you hear about Neville Chamberlain, and you hear about FDR, and you hear about their political policies, and you hear about the stock market crash. But there's also like, and at home, how were the women carrying on? You eventually do get a glimpse of the household, but you never have the South Asian common person at that time. They were there too, right? I know one of the interesting stories, I did a project many years ago interviewing early immigrants, and one of the points that they brought up was during the Depression and other times of recession, you never had a South Asian on apply for welfare or social assistance, I think it was called at that time, because they always said, send them to us and we're going to take care of them. Like the community would be together, and whether it was, and at that time it was, because it was such a small community, it was much more together, whether it was a Hindu, a Sikh, or a Muslim, as long as you were South Asian, you knew each other, you all attended the same temple, even though it was, you know, not everybody's religious everybody's religious background. So things like that, like those types of ideas, those types of stories you never hear.
Stories of people coming together back then in the history, and also drawing some of the same I think spirit as for today. Like what we're trying to represent as missing stories is not just, you know, how the communities have been mistreated or abused or excluded, but also how the community, you know, basically like how the community struggled and try to push up against the system. Mm-hmm. And part of that is, I think, the collectivist approach, where the communities bring in their own, the things that they, you know, hold dear, which is connectedness, and how in collectivist society they uplift each other as a community rather than as individuals. So we're hoping to focus on a few incidents, but one of the things that I think you already mentioned is how the Sikh temple used to be a hub for poetry, for people to come and actually perform religious services of their own aside from the Sikh religion. Muslim, Hindu, everyone was welcomed. So that's going to be like one key, I think, focus on basically portraying that this is a thing, this is a collectivist approach, and how the community has helped each other when the government or when the larger society did not see them as normal, did not want to to give them space. What do you think would be like an example of that in today's experience, or is it any better than then, or are there any things that is there anything that you would like to comment on that?
I personally think that that's something that's lacking today, because over the years, there's been more, not necessarily, there have been more divisions, just because of the size of the community. So you can't have just the one temple anymore.
Of course.
Right. So in the past, whereas it was more of a community center almost, nowadays it's not. Many people would find it offensive, I think, if somebody decided to have a gathering of poetry or people singing or something. I think the religious climate of the world also has something to do with that, like with 1984, amongst the Sikh community, which is, the Punjabi Sikh community is like the largest group amongst the South Asians here in the Lower Mainland. So definitely, I think something that is missing is and also because now we have masjids and we have mandirs, etc. So we don't have as much of the mixing as you might have had in the past, where there was only that one religious, like you said, the one religious spot where you could go and everybody interacted. So now, and even amongst those, there's even amongst the Sikh communities, there's sometimes different groups amongst them, people who hold different parts, who have a different interpretation of the religion, and others who have a different interpretation. So you don't have the same mixing. But if there's things like Bhangra schools and so on, where I think they act as a community a community center almost, because I know there's like people enroll their kids to learn Punjabi folk dance, and then the mothers sometimes make a team and the fathers hang out and so on. You have sports teams like that too sometimes. Maybe all the kids are on the same soccer team. So in some ways it's they're finding that in other areas now. But if there was something more like a community center, like I think in some areas you do have one. I'm trying to remember the name of, I think it's called Somerset or something in East Van, where there's a strong South Asian community there. And then most of the senior citizens and other people who make use of that community center are South Asian. So you sometimes have, I know they had a project there where they got local senior citizens and children, and they had them do a play, put on a play about, grandchildren and children. So wherever they see it, I think it's, that's the thing, wherever there is a strong concentration of a South Asian population, and then some of the workers there are also South Asian, then you have these types of activities occurring. But any place where there's, I wish you best of luck on your project.